Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing Hero Art's My Monthly Hero and My Monthly Superhero for August 2026. The theme for this month is Little Library. And for the My Monthly Hero, the first die set included is the Tiny Library die set. Then we have the Library Card and Pocket die set. And this can be used with the next set, which is the Library Card Stampin' Cut. So the Library Card Pocket and die set has a large rectangle, can be used for die cutting that large library card stamped image. So we also have 10 sheets of cardstock. These are 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches. And I'm mostly using this color palette for the cards that I'm creating in this video. I think the only color that I added to it was some Rainforest Cardstock. I wanted something that was a little bit brighter green. And we have like the mint here, which is really light pastel. So there's Bellini, Coral, Carrot, Terracotta, Tuscan, Mint, Seaside, Alabaster, Fawn, and Truffle cardstock. Now the My Monthly Superhero kit includes everything from the My Monthly Hero plus the Novel Greeting Stampin' Cut, that's that first set, then the Big Book die set, as well as the Classic Floral Layering Stencil set. So I'm going to be creating 4 cards in this video. The first 2 cards are going to be using the My Monthly Hero kit only. This last 2 cards are going to be the My Monthly Superhero kit. So we're going to have everything included in those 2 cards. So I'm starting off by using that Tiny Library die set. And I have a bunch of book backs that I've die cut out of different colors. There are 4 different book edges to choose from, and each one has 2 layers. So each one has 2 colors to it. So I die cut one out of the base layer in a completely different color for the top layer, and I made sure that they were all just a little bit different just for some variety. I'm using Barely Art glue to glue them all together. I like using liquid glue when I'm assembling die cuts because it gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy those pieces in place. There's also a sign for this Tiny Library. So I have that die cut out of the Seaside cardstock for the back and then the Fawn cardstock for the front. So I did the rest of the books off screen, and now we're ready to start assembling our Tiny Library. Now I'm, like I said before, using mostly just the colors from this kit. I added a little bit of Rainforest for I think it's the next card where I wanted my stems to have a bit of a brighter green to it. And then the black cardstock that I'm using is also from my stash. I wanted a few black accents for some of the different pieces, like the little worm eyes, as well as some of the book bindings. So these pieces are really easy to put together, but what I do before assembling anything is I will lay them all out on my crafting surface. I will put the pieces that go on top of something else really close to it, so they're super easy to grab and layer. I'm not digging through a pile of die cuts trying to find my pieces. I know that I have everything there before I start, and I just assemble things bit by bit. And obviously, as you have more of the pieces assembled, there's less pieces to assemble, and it makes it easier as you go along. For some of the larger pieces, I put the adhesive or the glue on the back of the die cut and then layer it on the larger piece. For some of those teeny tiny die cuts, a lot of these dies put little indents in the pieces that have pieces going on top of them. So you can put glue on those little pieces, little areas, and then use a wax tip tool from the handy tool set to lift that piece up and place it. So it makes it really easy. There is one little shelf here that I'm going to place, and you can adjust it to wherever you want it to go. So for that piece, I just layered that door or held that door in front of it so that I knew where I wanted it to be. So for my bottom shelf, I want that little reading worm there to be in that corner reading this open book. So I'm placing that there first, and then I'm going to place the other books on the top shelf, most of them going on the top shelf, some of them going toward or on the bottom shelf on the right-hand side. So for the top shelf, I'm going to start with the left-hand side and kind of work my way to the right, making sure that I have different colors of books beside each other, again, just for a little bit of variety. And I'm using most of the colors from the My Monthly Hero kit, but you can obviously do it in whatever color palette you want to. You don't have to stick with just these colors. You can definitely incorporate other colors in there as well. I just sometimes love the challenge of working with a kit and just working with the colors that are in that kit, because often those colors are not typical colors that I would use together. So it just kind of creates a little bit of a challenge and stretch the creative juices just a little bit. So once I have all of these pieces layered together, I can set that to the side. Now for this card here, I'm just keeping a very simple background to it. I'm just going to use the I think it's the mint color, and just having a very simple background to it. I don't do any ink blending on this particular card, but you certainly could if you wanted to add a little bit more visual dimension. And another option, if you happen to have or happen to get the My Monthly Superhero Kit, I think this would be really pretty with that layering stencil set, the classic floral layering stencil on the background. I think that would just add a really pretty background to it. Again, I kept it simple so that the tiny library was the focal point. I took that mint cardstock and I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. And I'm just putting it on a plain white A2 card base. Now I chose to use the mint for the background because I had used the seaside for some of the accents on my tiny library. And I didn't really want my background to be the same color as the accents on the tiny library, but you could easily swap those back and forth if you wanted your background to be blue instead of green. I'm just adding the base of the tiny library first, then I will add the upper part so that I know exactly where that's supposed to go, and then finally adding the sign to the front of it. Now you could leave this as is, but I always love finding ways of adding just a little bit of extra dimension. So I'm going to put some glossy accents on the spectacle parts, on the glass part of the little glasses for our little reading worm, and then in that upper window. And you could also put, say, acetate behind those door fronts before you assemble everything, and then that would have some gloss to it as well. That's also another option. Something that I actually didn't really think about until I was done the card and was putting the glossy accents on there. So when you first put the glossy accents on there, it has a milky tone to it, but it goes completely clear, and then it just adds some glossy domed dimension to those areas. When you're putting that glossy accents down, if you don't happen to get it to all of the corners, you can just use a die pick to just move it into those corners, but you definitely want to do that while it's still wet and liquid so that it will just even out after you've done that. So for the next card, I'm going to be using the library card and pocket die set as well as the library card Stampin' Cut. I'm going to start with the Stampin' Cut, stamping a sentiment as well as that library card. I haven't used this set yet, so I use a white eraser on the stamping surface just to remove any possible manufacturing residue on there. It just helps to take ink a little bit better. And I only do this one time. I do it the very first time I use a set. I do the entire set, so I know that if I've done, or if I've used one stamp from a set, I've done it to that set and I don't need to do it again. So I'm going to use that library card stamp. I'm also going to be using the thank you stamp as well as a sub-sentiment. So if some of the larger sentiments in this set have coordinating dies to go with them, the smaller sub-sentiments do not, but I'm going to be using, there's 2 different dies in the library card pocket and die set that almost look like washi tape that has ripped edges. So I'm going to be using that for the sub-sentiment. I'll be using the coordinating die for the thank you sentiment, and then I'll be using the large rectangle die from the library card pocket and die set to die cut that library card. Although for just that large rectangle, you could even just use your trimmer to trim it out. Sometimes that's a little bit quicker, but because I have to do that sub-sentiment anyways, I might as well do that at the same time. So we have the large sentiment out there, and I do tape those dies in place with some Best Ever Craft tape to make sure that they don't shift on me while I'm doing that die cutting. Another thing that I do, especially when it comes to, say, this die cut piece here, because we have long straight edges, I will angle that die in the die cutting machine. It makes it a little bit easier for the die cutting so we don't have one large or one straight edge going through that machine. It just makes it a little bit easier to run through. Sometimes if you have a straight edge and you don't angle it, it just takes a little bit of extra effort to get over that little hump from the edge of the die. So I have all of my florals here die cut. This is the one that I used, that Rainforest Cardstock, for the greens because I wanted them to be a little bit brighter. I used some of the coral cardstock for these flowers here, and I wanted to add just a little bit of shimmer to it. So I'm just doing a little bit of ink blending in the center of the flowers with some fruit salad interference ink. I'm using a detailed blending brush, so we still see that coral color on the outside part of our die cut here, but it just adds that extra little bit of color as well as that little bit of shimmer on the inside part. For my greenery, my leaves, I'm adding some Summer Garden to the base of it. If you've never used interference inks before, they are like a magic pad. They have 2 different colors. One shows up on white or light cardstock. The other color shows up on dark or black cardstock. So it's like 2 different ink pads in one. And even on the light colors, you'll see the color from the light cardstock, but when you tilt it into the light, you see that shimmer, that interference that typically shows up on the black cardstock. So it just really is a different type of ink to do ink blending with, and I love the final look. After doing the ink blending, I assembled the coral colored flowers with the ink blending, put the centers in them as well as layering 2 of them together to create a fuller flower. Then I assembled the Queen Anne's lace type flower and set those to the side. The ones that have the coral color cardstock with the ink blending, I didn't add those flowers to the stems yet. I will do that when I assemble those on the cards. I think I like doing it that way just so that I have a little bit of control where that flower goes. There's really no right or wrong. It's just a personal preference thing. I assembled the library pocket and just added a little bit of vintage photo distress ink around the outside edges just to give it a little bit of a worn shaded look. I'm also using that same vintage photo around that white library card, though you could use a lighter colored ink for that. I wanted it to have just a bit of an aged look, and I didn't want to have 1,000 inks or ink colors to be used in here, so I opted to use the same color for them. I set that to the side, and between each of those ink blendings on my mat, I do clean my mat off and set it to the side so it can be drying while I'm assembling my card. So I have all of my pieces here. I'm just going to put all of these pieces right onto my white A2 card base, but you certainly could add a different color as a mat behind it if you wanted to add a pop of color. I thought it would be nice to have just a very simple card with those florals, with that library pocket card with a little piece tucked into it, and just create something a little bit different that I don't normally do. What I do normally do though is put my florals to the left side of the card. I don't know why, it's just where I like them. Then I put my library pocket card to the right. I haven't glued the pocket down quite yet. I want some of my florals and greenery to go behind it, and I want some to go in front of it. So I'm going to do several of them, almost 2/3 of what I have here. Then I will glue down that library pocket card, and I'm only gluing down the pocket so you can still pull out that card. I wanted it to be removable, but you certainly could glue it right in if you wanted to. I think this would be a fun card for a librarian because it definitely suits them, suits what they do and something that they'd be familiar with. But also, I think it could just be for a book lover as well. I know nowadays we don't have those pockets with the library cards in it when you do borrow books from the library, but it's got a bit of nostalgia to it, and I just love the look of it. So once I glue down that pocket, we can start gluing down our florals and greenery in front of it. And for the greenery and florals that are in front of it, I did glue it just to the pocket so that that little insert is still removable again if you wanted it to. My paper clip there, I've die cut it out of some gold treasured cardstock in the pearl finish. I wanted it to have a little bit of a metallic look to it. You could also do silver here. I chose gold simply because of the colors I was using for the pocket as well as the florals. I thought gold would coordinate with that better, but you could certainly use whatever metallic you wanted. To add just a touch more sparkle, I'm just putting a little bit of Stickles in the center of those coral flowers and a little tiny dots of it on the Queen Anne's lace, but I'm not completely covering it. It is interference, it's transparent. You're still going to see the color of cardstock underneath there, but it's going to add that texture as well as that bit of sparkle. So now we're moving on to the last 2 cards using the My Monthly Superhero kit. Now for these cards, I don't really use the stuff from the I don't really blend the 2 kits together really. For the next 2 cards, I'm going to be using the Novel Greeting Stampin' Cut, the Big Book die set, as well as that classic floral layering die set. But you certainly could even add some of the floral die cuts from the library card pocket and die set like I just used on the last card. I think they would be a fun addition to the front of a book as well. I chose to do 2 different large books. This first one here is more of a classic looking book. So I've die cut it out of the fawn cardstock as well as the truffle cardstock. I'm using some interference inks in the milk chocolate roses as well as doing a little bit of vintage photo distress ink around there. I wanted to have the, again, aged look to it, but I also wanted that little bit of shimmer you get from the interference, and I only did that right around the edges. So we see mostly the brown color, but when you tilt it into the light, there's a little tiny bit of coral shimmer on there. Now for the pages, for the edge pages, this piece here that I'm gluing down, as well as the back of the book, I die cut those out of that gold pearl treasured cardstock. So I wanted it to look like gold edges on this book as well as gold details on the binding of the book. For the front of the book, there is a die that just does a really thin rectangle. I have that die cut out of gold as well. Now when you pull that out of the die, you do want to be really careful. It is very, very fragile. and it's really easy to bend and warp. So it's a little tiny bit of a challenge putting it on the book cover, making sure that it's nice and straight. I'm using that liquid glue, so it does give me a little bit of wiggle room when I'm adding it to it. Another option would be to put some adhesive on the cardstock before die cutting, and then you could just take the tape backing off. This is what works for me because I have that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy it, but I did want to let you know that it is a little bit challenging because that die cut is really narrow and thin. I use the seafoam cardstock for the bookmark coming out of here, and then gold once again for the tassel on the bookmark. Now for that bookmark, I didn't add any ink blending to it, but you certainly could. Now I want to add a sentiment to the front of this book, so I'm going to use the Novel Greetings Stampin' Cut set. I'm going to do 2 different sentiments, but I'm going to do them separately because I want them to have completely different looks to them. So I'm going to start with one sentiment for this book, and I'm going to do it on the fawn cardstock so that it coordinates with the cover from that book. I'm going to heat emboss it with some gold embossing powder so that it also coordinates with those gold accents that we've added on the book cover as well as the pages and the book binding. So I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock before brushing it off and then stamping it with some Versamark ink. Then I can add my gold embossing powder. Now when I do my sentiments, when possible, I do use super fine embossing powder. It just gives you a little bit more detail. It's just a little bit finer, and I just like the final look of it. But if you have regular gold embossing powder, that will work as well. It just will be a little bit thicker. And for most sentiments like these, you won't really notice the difference, but for teeny tiny sub sentiments, you definitely notice a huge difference between those 2 embossing powders. Once I have that heat embossed, I let that cool for, I don't know, 5-10 seconds, and then I tape my coordinating die on there and die cut it. Now I chose to keep this the same color as my book binding or the book front, but you certainly could do it in a contrasting color if you wanted it to pop off just a little bit more. I do that with my next card. I wanted both of them to look completely different from each other. So this one is more kind of the look of a classic book, an older book. The other one is more, I'm going to use the floral layering stencil set, so it has some floral on the cover, so it's going to have a completely different look to it. Now I chose to put this directly onto my A2 card base, but you certainly could add a background to it if you wanted to have a little bit of pattern or a little bit of color behind there. You could use the floral layering stencil set to create a pattern background to it, or you could use a contrasting color if you just wanted to have the book on a pop of color. I kept it really simple because I just love the look of that book there. Now I'm going to do my 4th card, and I'm going to start off with some Hammermill cardstock, and I'm going to stencil using the classic floral layering stencil set. Now these stencils are 6x6 in size, so what I typically do is I'll put my cardstock on my mat. I'll use some painter's tape to create kind of registration marks for the top left corner and the bottom right corner. When I go to layer each additional stencil on there, I only need to coordinate or match those 2 corners, and the rest of it is going to match up. For the first layer, I'm using Mermaid Lagoon interference ink. It's nice and it's got a beautiful teal color, and I think it's going to be just something a little bit different for the greenery on this book front. For the next layer, I'm going to use a combination of that Summer Garden interference ink as well as that Mermaid Lagoon interference ink. Now I'm choosing to stencil this in interference ink simply because I like the bright color, but I also love that little bit of shimmer, and I wanted this book color to have a book cover to have a bit of a different look to it. But you certainly could just use your favorite inks for stenciling and for ink blending as well. Those will absolutely work. I love that little bit of shimmer it gives. It just is something that reflects off the light, and even for stenciled images, it just adds a little bit of wow, in my opinion, to your stenciling. So once I have that second layer done, we can add the 3rd layer and line that up. This is the main flowers, and I'm going to do those in fruit salad. So we're going all the way around. Now, when I'm doing that stenciling, I go in clockwise and counterclockwise motion. I want to make sure that I don't have heavy ink on one side of the stencil and light ink on the other. I want to make sure that I get the whole area, and it's especially important to do this as those areas get smaller, because with those brush bristles, it's easy to miss an edge from a stencil opening when you have really tiny openings. So we have the fourth and final layer here, and this one I'm doing with the milk chocolate roses. This is a chocolate color, a brown color, but it has a beautiful coral shimmer to it. So it works really well with that fruit salad. So once again, going over that whole thing. Now my piece of hammer mill cardstock here is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm going to be using the die for the book cover with this. So this is just going to be the cover of the front of the book. So there is going to be some leftover that you could use for something else if you wanted once you're done, or you could use it with one of the other dies and create another card with it. So once I have that done, I set that aside to dry. I also want some cardstock in order to do my page edges as well as that rectangle on the front of the card and the book binding. So I took another piece of hammer mill cardstock and I used that fruit salad pad. I wanted those pieces to coordinate with my stenciled image. The easiest way to match up these interference inks is just use white cardstock and use those interference inks on them. So I just did direct to pad on that cardstock first, then I used my ink blending brush. It just works a little bit quicker that way, especially if you have a juicy pad. Once I have that covered, I took it off of my sticky mat and I set it aside to completely dry so that my pieces are dry when I go to do my die cutting. I'm going to use another one of those stamps from the Novel Greetings Stamp and Cut for the title / sentiment for my card. I did it on a scrap piece of hammer mill cardstock and I'm heat embossing it with some white embossing powder. Once I have it heat embossed, I'm going to use that fruit salad ink on that cardstock, and then the white embossing is going to completely resist my sentiment. So my sentiment is going to show up white, but the background cardstock is going to be that fruit salad interference. So it's going to be that color, but it's also going to have that beautiful shimmer that you get from the interference, and it's going to coordinate with those page edges, the border area on the front of my book. And I was about to say the book binding detail, but I just realized that I die cut that out of a completely different color for just a little bit of variety. So once we have those pieces die cut, I can set them off to the side. This is that border part, and you can see how thin that is. When you take it out of that die, you have to be really, really careful because it warps really, really easily, but it's such a beautiful detail on the book as well. So it's definitely not something that I would omit because I really love the look of that detail. So once we have all of our pieces set aside, we can start to assemble our book. I have it die cut out of some mint cardstock. So I have the book base as well as the little binding detail die cut out of that mint. Then I'm going to use the Mermaid Lagoon interference ink for some light ink blending around the edge. I don't need to ink blend on the front of that book because that printed paper, that printed stenciled background that we just did is going to completely cover that. For my bookmark, I use some of that coral cardstock and use some of the fruit salad interference ink to do just a little bit of light ink blending around the outside edge. I still want to see that coral color, but by ink blending it, it gives it a little bit of visual dimension and a little bit more of, I want to say, a worn look to it, just like the front of the last book. So I'm adding the pages first, then I'm going to add the book binding detail. Then I'm going to add the bookmark for the last book or for the last card. I did my cover first and then realized I should insert that bookmark. This time I realized might as well just put it on there first. And obviously you can stick that bookmark as much or as little out. There's also a eyeglasses die in this set, so you can have a pair of eyeglasses as well. I wear eyeglasses every day, so I just pretend when it comes to fantasy cards that I don't need them when I'm reading. So I opted not to do that, but that's definitely an option with this die set as well. Once I have that stenciled background on there, we can add the border. And once that border is on there, I'm going to add my sentiment to the front of that book. Now, because we use the fruit salad interference ink on that stenciled image as well as those page edges and the background of that sentiment, it coordinates beautifully with that book. We have everything that coordinates perfectly. The tassel for the bookmark, I just have that die cut out of that alabaster cardstock. So once we have that done, this is another one where I'm just putting it on the base of the card. This one obviously is a lot more elaborate than the last book, so I don't think it needs anything behind it. You could obviously add a different color cardstock behind it if you want, but I certainly wouldn't be doing a stencil background with this. I would keep the stencil focused on the front of the card just so that that book had some uniqueness to it. Now I wanted to add just a touch more texture to the book, so I added a little bit of that the Stickles just where I have these stenciled milk chocolate roses. So it's not covering the flower completely, it's just covering the milk chocolate roses ink, and it just adds that little bit of extra texture to that book front, and I just love the look of it. So here it is once it's dry. These cards and this whole collection is perfect for book lovers, and I absolutely love reading. So this collection is totally up my alley and could be used for so many different occasions. Several of the sentiments in that novel greeting Stampin' Cut are thank you or gratitude ones. You could also use these for birthday cards. I think this would be fun if you wanted to give, say, a gift card to a bookstore. This would be a fun way to do that. There are so many, obviously, different ways to use this collection, but it is so fun. And that tiny library, that very first one, I think it's my favorite. I just love tiny libraries. I don't stop at them, but I always get a smile on my face when I drive by them. You'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. Now, if you are a reader, I'm kind of curious, what type of books do you like to read, and what is your absolute favorite? Because I always like to look for new books to put on my TBR. Not that it's not long enough already, but I'm always curious what other people are reading. And as I've said before, I kept my color palette to the colors in the My Monthly Hero Kit, but you certainly could change them up and have a lot more variety. This is the stenciled background that I think would be really pretty behind that tiny library there. I think it would look absolutely adorable in that background, giving it a little bit more visual contrast to that background. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.